Okay, Richard, I know you've trailed lots and lots of bucks and deer over the years. Um, One of the questions I will have for you, because it's a common one, is to you, with as much experience that you have, what is the toughest blood trail to follow?
Well, gut shots, high back hits, and broken legs. Those are some of the toughest to recover.
And
And
go ahead.
one lung hits are tough too, and liver hits also.
I mean, we always talk about gut shots, but I think the ones that do get overlooked are those high back hits, the leg hits, which are fatal if you can catch up to them. Let's look at those. Let's look at those two specifically. A high back hit. What are the troubles in following it, and what are your odds of actually finding that deer?
Well, the biggest thing that hunters need to do if they drop a deer with either a bow or gun immediately, shoot it again. That can save a tremendous amount of problem. When you drop a deer immediately, you assume you broke the back. But if you just clip the backbone, stun the deer, it'll be down temporarily, but then get up and go. By shooting that deer a second time with an arrow or a bullet or a slug, you anchor that animal, reduce the chances it's going to get up if you have that opportunity. Once a high back hit deer is up and moving, uh, they can cover long distances and they're difficult to recover. There's a poor blood trail. I've been fortunate enough to be able to trail a number of high back deer hit in the high back in snow, which makes it easier to stay on their track. Usually, even if you don't have blood associated with that type of hit, they're dragging a leg or something like that to differentiate their track from other healthy deer. I've recovered a number of high back hit deer, but it required considerable effort.
Considerable effort, and a lot of times you have to put another shot on that deer, right?
Exactly.
Yeah.
Always, you have to shoot them again in order to get them.
Okay, a couple things here. He's Richard Smith. If you don't know Richard and you're younger, you need. This is one of the many books that he has produced in his life, Tracking Wounded Deer. The best book I've seen on the subject. I know it's been in multiple publication or multiple printings over the years. Richard, you have the distinguished honor of, and I don't know, Jack Brower told me this, but it was your idea that started Deer and Deer Hunting as a magazine. You were, I believe, the third member to join Stump Sitters when they turned it public as a
Uh-huh.
club, and you guys had been sending in your notes all those years, and then you called Jack up, I believe, if I'm getting the story correctly, and said, "Hey, don't we get a newsletter or something for this?" And Jack said, "Hey, that's a great idea. Let's start a magazine."
Well, that's the first time I'm hearing that, Dan.
Yep.
It's good to hear that. I didn't know
That would have been in
myself that.
1977. I think it was, if my memory serves me correctly, which my memory is pretty good. I think Jack told me it was about in February or March of 1977 that you guys had that conversation. And then they came out with the magazine. It was basically, well, the magazine was, as you know, two pieces of paper folded together and stapled together
Yeah.
um, a, maybe a month or two later. And that's how they started the magazine. But yeah, I mean, you date back to the beginning. And I know I don't want to make you blush or get you too, give you too big of a head. But as far as the Deer and Deer Hunting All Stars, Charlie Alsheimer, Leonard Root, John Ozoga, Bob Zaglin, and Richard Smith, I've always put you five guys right there as the pioneers in helping people not only learn more about deer, but things like this, blood trailing. You've done so much of it over the years, and especially I know in your home state of Michigan, you've done so much for those hunters there that I can't even begin to. I mean, how many decades have you been doing it?
A long time.
Long time. You started back. I know it was it the 70s or the 60s.
The 70s. I started deer hunting in the 60s, obviously, but my first book I wrote was published appropriately at about the time the Stump Sitters launched. It was published in 1978. It was simply titled Deer Hunting, the book. And that book is now in its fourth edition, all color photos, 400 and some pages. Um, it's done extremely well for me.
1978. Now, who did you have that published with? Do you remember?
Stackpole Books.
Stackpole did it.
Yes.
That is one of them. Richards has so many. He did one with Krause, Stan Hunting for Whitetails. We're going to give you that link in the description of this podcast. I want to thank you guys for joining us for the Deer Talk Now podcast. We're going to talk a lot of things with Richard today. We're going to have him back because there's so many topics I want to discuss. Blood trailing was the first one. We talked about those high hits. When you talk about leg hits, I've had very painful blood trails on broken legs. And one thing I believe I learned from you, number one, when you talked about shooting every deer twice, that was actually an article you wrote for us probably 20 years ago, basically called Shoot Every Deer Twice. No matter how good you think you shot it, if that deer's laying there, put another arrow in it, put another bullet in it if you can. But on leg hits, you had, I believe, had taught everyone on that leg hit deer, if you know you busted its leg, get down and get after it immediately.
Exactly.
And why would you recommend that as opposed to waiting?
It promotes blood loss. It keeps the wound open and the wound bleeding, and increases your chances of staying on that blood trail and pushing the animal until it weakens enough that you can get another shot at it if you can. If in situations I've been successful recovering deer with broken legs is in snow. It's much easier to stay on that animal for miles if necessary. And in some cases, it does require that much effort to catch up to him and shoot him again. And I trailed one broken leg deer. It was a doe that somebody else wounded. They shot it with buckshot, broke a hind leg, trailed it. And I noticed that it would hit a road and it would run down the road to try and increase the distance to us. The next time it came to a woods road, I ran as fast as I could after the track and finally saw it and got another shot in it and dropped it.
Wow.
So you've got to pay attention to what a wounded deer is doing and how it's behaving and take advantage of that to try and finish it off.
Boy, that sounds like one we had up in northern Wisconsin. My buddy Joe, who's listening to this podcast, I know. We trailed one for 3.5 miles. Now, that's not, that happens. It happens. You shoot a deer. My brother had shot the deer, busted its leg right just below the chest cavity. That deer ran 3.5 miles, jumped in a lake, and swam across the lake. And
Wow.
had there not been a reef of ice there, it died in the reef of ice. That shows you just the tenacity of a deer. And we know they can survive. You've done stories about it. We know that they can survive with broken legs.
Exactly.
And didn't you do a story on a doe that busted its leg and still continued to have fawns?
Exactly. She broke a hind leg that healed crooked. So she lived for a number of years after that and raised a number of fawns.
That's crazy, crazy, crazy. Okay, one more thing on blood trailing. Let's talk about the shots that are more close to what we call the boiler zone. I mean, but if you're hitting a deer, because I know you have tremendous insights on gut. Let's talk about gut shots. What are your golden rules for a bullet or an arrow that either hits the intestines or the paunch?
To back off as long as possible. If you shoot a deer in the evening, wait till morning if you can. If there's no snow or rain forecast, wait as long as possible before trailing that animal. You'll often find them within a couple hundred yards or maybe a little beyond that. A gut shot deer typically will change bedding sites frequently. They're uncomfortable, they're weak. They'll get up and move 10 yards a number of times. When you see a number of beds close together, that's a typical behavior of gut shot deer. Most hunters make a mistake by trying to trail those animals too soon. And once they're jumped, they get a shot of adrenaline. They can go a long distance, and the entry and exit wounds often plug with intestinal matter or fat, making them difficult. But the one important thing that deer hunters have access to today that they didn't years ago is almost every state is legal to use leash dogs to recover wounded deer. Uh, Gut shots is a type of injury that tracking dogs can follow very easily and help hunters recover. Fortunately, I've seen this spread of the use of tracking dogs to recover wounded deer over the period of years I've been dealing with the subject, and it's a major benefit to deer hunters how many blood trailing dogs are now available in the country.
It's amazing. And the way these guys are training these dogs, we watched one here at the office last year. Noah Rux, Brad Rux's son, shot a 165-inch buck. But
Wow.
he came down, he smelled that arrow, and immediately backed out. I told him he did everything perfect. That deer was in a Tagaller swamp, and the little dog that they brought out the next morning, as fast as that dog could run, it got to the deer, and it went
Uh-huh.
400 or 500 yards.
Yeah.
And that deer it wasn't dead yet. It was still alive, could not get up in its first bed. But that is testament to what you just said. Normally, what I've found, if you just leave them alone, they're going to be either dead or you're going to find them right there. Now, they could get pushed by coyotes, but let's talk about that. Some people try to make that excuse. Well, there's coyotes in the area, or it's raining tonight. I say it's still not going to die. I think you would, now my opinion, let me know your opinion. My opinion is you still wait. You got to take that chance.
Yeah, I think that's important. Um, you're going to lose a deer. You increase the chances of losing the deer if you push it too soon, jump it, there's no blood trail, uh, rather than waiting. That increases your chances you can recover that deer. You may lose some deer to coyotes. One time, my brother shot a nice buck, a nice 8-point buck with a crossbow. Based on the blood trail, I thought it was a questionable hit. So we backed off until morning. By morning, coyotes had consumed the whole deer. But that doesn't happen every time. That's the only case we've had that happen.
Yeah, it's a risk you run. Let's touch quickly on liver shots. How does your thinking change if you're pretty sure that you either clipped the liver or maybe center punched it?
Well, it's important to wait at least a couple hours if you can before trailing a liver hit deer to give those animals a chance to weaken and increase the chances if they're still alive, you can get another arrow or another bullet in them to finish them off.
And what are your telltale signs for distinguishing between a liver hit and a straight up gut shot?
Well, there's usually food matter if you're hunting with a bow. There's food matter and a strong odor associated with the arrow. With a gun, usually you'll see food matter on the ground mixed in with hair. I've spent a lot of time learning how the types of hair varies on a whitetail's body. And in fact, in the book, the third edition of Tracking Wounded Deer, there's color photos showing how deer hair varies on different types of a deer's body. By knowing how that hair varies, you can help determine if you made a gut shot or a liver shot. And it's usually easy to tell a gut shot deer. There's usually even food matter mixed in with the blood. If you start trailing that deer, that's a sure sign that you should back off if you can.
I agree. And the one thing, I don't know, you might have taught me this as well, on liver hits, how I can kind of sort of get an educated guess is that blood is almost like an opaque maroonish color as opposed to that really dark blood that we see. It's almost black in some cases.
Yeah.
On a gut shot. So it's
Yeah,
time
exactly.
time and experience, I guess. You're going to have to get on a few trails and then dissect those deer after you shoot them to see where you hit it
Exactly.
and further that learning process.
And when you're looking at hair sign, it's important to determine if the hair is from the entry wound or the exit wound. Sometimes an arrow or a bullet will travel toward the rear of a body and you'll have white hair from the belly from an exit wound, but the entry is liver or lung. So it's important to know the difference, how a deer was standing when you took the shot and things like that.
Richard has these photos in this book. If you guys are watching the video version of the podcast, in this book, he actually puts clumps of hair and shows you. It's a great teaching tool. I know we've done posters over the years for deer and deer hunting, but it's those little things, excuse me, hair, blood, And those signs after the shot. What did the deer do? How did it react? Where did it run? Where's the last place you saw it? Those types of things. I want to get to some more topics here, Richard, because I have a lot. We're gonna, like I said, we're gonna save some. Okay, we're gonna switch gears now, and we're gonna talk about bears. And I kind of gave it away there because you have really, in addition to everything you've done with whitetails, you've done a lot with black bears, haven't you?
Exactly.
You've hunted them all over the place, and you've studied their relationship with whitetails. Like I said, I just gave it away. So, what is the most underrated predator when it comes to whitetail fawns?
Black bears.
Black bears. And why is that?
Well, they're important predators on fawns, and this has been confirmed over and over again through studies. And John Azoga, the research editor for Deer and Deer Hunting, was one of the first biologists who confirmed how much impact single black bears can have on fawn survival. He did research in a square mile enclosure at the Cusino Research Station. A single young bear got in that enclosure each of 3 different years. One was only 55 or 65 pounds, one was 100, and the third one was similar in size. Each of those 3 years, fawn mortality increased by 22% from single young black bears. Every bear that's at least a year old preys on fawns. And John thought is that one of the young bears that got in the enclosure killed as many as 9 fawns before he trapped it and removed it from the enclosure. I've been involved in a research project with bears in the UP where a couple of adult females were habituated to us so we could walk with them, watch what they did. And while walking with bears, I've seen bears kill 2 different fawns. The main researcher, Terry DeBryan, saw one adult female kill as many as 6 fawns one year, but he wasn't with her all the time. This shows how much impact black bears can have on fawns. And a lot of hunters are unaware of this. We have in excess of 10,000 bears that are at least a year old in the UP. If you figure there's at least 40 to 50,000 fawns every year, minimum, that black bears kill. During another research project in the UP, they put a GPS collar with a video camera on an adult male. That video camera captured 3 fawns that bear killed and ate. So there's plenty of verification that black bears are important predators on fawns. And we've been under harvesting bears in the UP, and it's impacting our deer population. Wolves have an impact, so do coyotes, but we can't do anything about wolves. They're on the endangered species list. We can increase the bear harvest. Right now in the UP, there's less than 0.5 hunter per square mile in our bear management units. We can increase the bear licenses, increase the bear harvest, and increase fawn survival.
Fawn survival. And we're not talking just about the UP of Michigan, northern Wisconsin. We're talking about now states like Florida. They don't have bear hunting seasons. They should, because there are so many black bears down there. They are a problem. A couple points to what Richard was talking about. People say, oh, that was an enclosure. It was a 640-acre enclosure. Okay, think about that for a second. That's a section of land, and that was one black bear. And now when they extrapolated that research out, in some cases, bear predation on fawns can be upwards of 70 to 80% if you have a very high black bear population, which some places do. And if you have a lower deer population, northern Wisconsin, northern Minnesota, Florida, you can look at those things and understand the problems. So like Richard, you say, it would be very easy. I had the numbers. I forgot to bring them with me. I think you guys have about, 4,000 to 5,000 bear tags that they issue in Michigan?
Yeah, in the UP, there's just over 5,000 bear tags issued last fall.
5,000. They issued 12,000 in Wisconsin.
Exactly.
And we I think we harvest about maybe 6,000 bears, which is totally sustainable. I think all hunters in all states should be lobbying for those things, because it's not It's not just because of deer, it's for managing that resource. Am I not right?
Exactly. Reducing conflicts with people and other problems they can cause. There was a study done in Wisconsin in the Chickwawanin National Forest that found that black bears were the number one predator on
That's my
fawns.
stomping grounds. That's where I grew up hunting.
In that study, in the study conducted in the UP, bears were found number two behind coyotes, but it varied by year. Some years, bears killed more collared fawns than coyotes. So they are a very important predator. And even during that research in the UP, one radio collared adult doe during November was killed by a black bear, documented.
Well, we know that happens. Let's talk about wolves for a second. You said, well, they're on the endangered list, but, and you know where I'm going with this, what are your thoughts on wolves? Are they endangered and should they be hunted and trapped?
They're definitely not endangered. We know that very clearly. They've long since surpassed the minimum population goal that was set when they were originally put on the endangered species list, and only through political intervention and lawsuits by anti-hunting groups has enabled the wolf to remain on the endangered species list when they shouldn't be. Yes, they should be hunted. They should be trapped. Wisconsin has had a number of seasons when they were off the endangered species list. Unfortunately, Michigan did not establish a wolf season when they were off the list. They drugged their feet long enough that they were put back on.
What what's the wolf population like there? I know they just found one in Lower Michigan here a couple weeks ago.
Yeah.
Um,
Well, they say a minimum population of 650 wolves, but they do the count during the winter when track counts and looking at radio collars when the population is at the lowest. When you look at the population after pups are born, that it go doubles or triples in size. We clearly have over 1,000 wolves in Michigan and maybe higher. They're going to a new trail camera system to try and estimate our wolf population. And I think that will bring some valuable data to the table to increase the chances of getting them off the endangered species list when those population estimates go up.
and you guys are in a precarious situation because the Upper Peninsula is unlike any other landscape in America, in my opinion. It's not my opinion; it's a fact. Your boom and bust tendencies of your deer herds are fragile to begin with, and now you put apex predator like a wolf, a black bear, and throw in all those coyotes, which are still the number one predator
Yeah.
on deer. What's the forecast for deer in the UP?
Well, it's not good. When you put tough winters on top of those predators, it really drains the population, reduces recruitment, and we lose adults during severe winters too. Part of the problem is we've had too restrictive hunting regulations. Since 2008, we have a combination deer license that comes with two buck tags. Prior to 2008, one of those buck tags was unrestricted, and the second was restricted to bucks with 4 points on an antler or more. Nobody has a problem with the second buck tag being restricted. The first buck tag should have remained that way, but in 2008, both buck tags became restricted. One buck had to have 3 points or more on an antler, and the second buck 4 points or more. That protected too many deer, and the purpose of it was to try and increase the number of old age bucks in the population. Well, that hasn't worked. Since 2008, the number of older age bucks in the harvest has declined steadily. And last fall was one of the worst on record as far as antlered buck harvest in the UP. We've we protected deer from hunters so they can die during the winter. That's terrible management. There's a record during the predator prey study that was conducted in the UP. They put out baited trail cameras to count deer at 61 sites in study areas. It clearly shows the number of adult bucks photographed at those sites declined by more than 70% over two severe winters. And many of those bucks hunters were forced to pass up because of antler restrictions. And it was very wasteful. And before those deer died, they did tremendous damage to the winter habitat. So our winter habitat can no longer support the number of deer it used to.
That is crazy and all true. Deer Talk Now is brought to you by Moultrie Mobile. The all-new feed hub from Moultrie Mobile is a remote game feed manager that's compatible with all major feeders. Remotely check feed levels, schedule feeding times, and instantly dispense feed directly from the Moultrie Mobile app. For more information, go to moultriemobile.com. What do you say to people saying, well, that's the UP, that's different. Where I live in, the lower Michigan, or where I live in Pennsylvania, where we have state mandated antler point restrictions, I support them. What do you say to people who say that, and what do you say about the state mandating antler point restrictions on whitetail herds?
They're unnecessarily restrictive. With declining hunter numbers, there's nowhere that biologically mandatory antler point restrictions are necessary to manage our deer population. With declining hunter numbers, there's enough survival of yearling bucks to produce older age bucks. And you know as well as I do that most veteran hunters voluntarily pass up young bucks. A regulation mandating it is not necessary. Well, in effect, it protects deer that don't need protection. Private property owners have the option of making antler restrictions as restrictive as they want. 90% of the bucks in Michigan are killed on private property. Those private property owners can set antler restrictions. It's not necessary to mandate by the state to have antler point restrictions. And the biggest problem with mandatory antler point restrictions is they spread disease. We had a 3-year experiment in the southern UP chronic wasting disease management zone, testing mandatory antler point restrictions to see if that would increase the harvest of antlerless deer and reduce the population. It didn't work. The population increased after the 3-year study, but more importantly, it protected yearling bucks that had chronic wasting disease, and it increased the spread of the disease. I hate to see what the prevalence rates for chronic wasting disease are now in that zone after that 3-year experiment. The DNR refuses to have mandatory testing of deer from those zones to confirm how high the prevalence rate has gone because of that experiment. They rely on voluntary testing, and very few people bring in their deer voluntarily.
Very few people
so
do.
They're not getting enough data.
Boy, you've given me, my brain is working overtime here because I've got so many different questions. But I want to stay on the, I got your thoughts on APRs, but now let's go to a lot of states. If they haven't already enacted it, they're thinking about it. Some states have a 2-buck limit, some states have more, some states now are saying we want to go to a 1-buck limit, and I think this is being driven by primarily trophy hunters. What are your thoughts on that?
Well, it's unnecessary biologically. If you're going to manage a deer population based on biology, it's not necessary. In Michigan, a very small percentage of the hunters shoot 2 bucks, 2 antlered bucks, even though it's legal for hunters to shoot 2 yearling bucks, two antlered bucks. In the Upper Peninsula, 1 or 2% of hunters shoot 2 bucks. And in the Lower Peninsula, it's 4 or 5%, very low. When you go to a 1-buck bag limit, I grew up with a 1-buck bag limit in the 60s and 70s. You have a lot of hunters buying girlfriends and wives tags so they can shoot 2 deer anyway. But those of us who follow the law are limited to shooting 1 buck, and it reduces recreational opportunity. Having a 2nd buck tag provides thousands and thousands of hours of recreation without a drain on the population. Very few people fill those 2nd tags, but they have the opportunity to, which keeps them in the field. That's what deer hunting is about.
That's a great point, because we have that here too, and I've seen it across the country. Because some people, the devil's advocates say, well, if not that many people are shooting him, why give the tag out? For that reason, because that guy might not shoot that deer, but he's hunting into November, he's hunting into December, he's maybe going muzzleloader hunting. Whatever he's doing, he's filling up his truck at the gas station. That trickle-down economics, although you might not think it's that big, it really is. And that's for deer hunting in general, which...
And the revenue, state agency revenue is declining with the
Yep.
reduced hunter numbers. If you go to $1 bag limit, that can cut the revenue even farther.
You guys are down a couple thousand hundred hunters.
Yeah.
Since I started here in '94, I think Michigan was pushing almost 1 million deer hunters, as was Pennsylvania. You're down to what, 600,000 maybe?
Or even lower, 450,000 or something like that.
It's half.
It's declined.
It's half, and it's so we talk about that, and I think what people kind of get off on tangents is they get frustrated. I want to hunt big bucks. I want to do this. I want to do that. And then we're talking about disease, and I'm going to shift. Do I have that on my topic here? I'm gonna shift to chronic wasting disease. And I've said this so many times, Ian, I don't know how many times on this podcast. If this is the Sistine Chapel and it's burning, and chronic wasting disease is such a threat, and I'm not saying that it isn't, I'm just saying that if that is the looming threat over the hunting community, why are we squabbling over these things? Why are we squabbling over APRs and limiting buck harvest from 2 to 1 or 3 to 1 or whatever it happens to be? What are your thoughts on chronic wasting disease, Richard, and what does it bode for hunting in the future?
Well, it's a serious concern because of the number of states it's now present in, and it's increasing every year. We need to focus more on giving hunters the opportunity to harvest as many deer as possible of both sexes in all age classes. Hunters need to be educated. Adult does that are infected with chronic wasting disease pass it on to their fawns. We know that through research. So harvesting.
Hang on, let's stop there for a minute. Because I want you to reemphasize that point. Does are passing on the disease to their newborn fawns.
Exactly.
And that disease then is it dormant until it starts manifesting itself when that deer is 3, 4, 5, 6 years old?
No.
Okay.
It's in the animal, and very few fawns have been tested for the disease is part of the problem. But among the fawns that have been tested in Michigan, a number of counties, fawns have tested positive for the disease. And the primary way they get it is from their mothers. And protecting yearling bucks, as mandatory antler point restriction does, increases the spread of the disease by protecting diseased yearlings that have it, both does and bucks. So it's important with the presence of chronic wasting disease to allow hunters to take as many deer of both sexes in all age classes as possible. And with reduced hunter numbers, that's more difficult. But putting impediments in the way, making restrictive harvest regulations is not going to solve the chronic wasting disease issue.
How worried? Okay, we know the disease affects deer herds. I have yet to see a case where it has actually significantly reduced a deer herd outside of a very, very small sample in it wasn't North Dakota. It was I'd have to look it up. It was no, it wasn't Wyoming. It was Nebraska, northwest Nebraska, but a small reservation herd. I mean, we're talking a couple hundred animals. And they're like, well, it was reduced by 500. Well, yeah, I know, but you had like 700 deer to begin with. Anyways, outside of the threat to the herd, what are your concerns, if any, on it somehow morphing into a human situation?
Well, in Michigan, in our southern Michigan chronic wasting disease management zone, where that 3-year experiment with mandatory antler point restrictions increased the prevalence of the disease, more and more people are going to be eating deer that have chronic wasting disease. I hope it doesn't jump to humans, but with more exposure, the chances of that happening increases. Department of Natural Resources in Michigan is doing a terrible job in monitoring the prevalence of the disease in the state, which increases the risk to hunters. Maybe they're concerned that if hunters find out how prevalent the disease is in certain counties, they'll stop hunting. I don't know. But if they're going to manage for the disease, it's important for them to have data on how prevalent it is. And they need to go to mandatory testing in counties where it's known to exist. Uh, they they went to new counties in the Northwest Lower Peninsula last fall on a voluntary basis to try and check for chronic wasting disease. They had a goal number of the number of deer they wanted to test. With voluntary testing, they got a fraction of their quota to test. The disease could be there, and they didn't test enough animals to find it. And if they maintain the voluntary testing, they're not going to get any solid data.
Excellent information, Richard. I'm kind of circling back again. When you were talking about provide opportunities for hunters to shoot deer of both sexes and in all age classes, which brings us up to doe hunting, which is another hot button topic across the country right now. In your opinion, are there areas that have been overshot? Too many does being taken?
Not in my knowledge. Now, when you talk about regions like northern Wisconsin, northern Michigan, where severe winters and a tremendous number of predators are at play, uh, those can impact the deer population to the point where recruitment's reduced and the number of antlerless deer are reduced. Uh, in those circumstances, and in the South, like Texas, where they have droughts during the summer, that can reduce deer survival and recruitment of fawns as well. I think those are more important factors in negatively impacting the number of does. In areas where doe harvests are high, it increases the percentage, the ratio of bucks to does, which is a good thing. A lot of hunters want to see that. I think in areas where drought and winters, severe winters, and predators are not a major problem, I think it's difficult to overharvest antlerless deer. Most hunters aren't willing to do it.
That's very true, and that goes back to our roots growing up, where you just didn't shoot them. You've hunted a lot in the South over the years. I know that you hunted with Realtree a lot. You hunted some of those southern states where they had just ridiculous, what I say ridiculous, like you can shoot a doe a day or shoot as many as you want. Have you ever seen a problem in those types of situations?
Uh, no, I haven't. I had it in South Carolina where they had a deer season open August 15th.
Yep, one of the
And I
earliest in the
forget
country.
how many bucks and does you could shoot. And they were harvesting liberal numbers of deer. And I don't think that negatively impacted the populations. They, the deer are so productive in the South. Probably a lot of doe fawns breed and produce fawns as yearlings, where that doesn't happen much in the northern country where we have severe winters.
Yeah, they got to reach a
So
certain weight to be able to do it.
exactly. So they're very productive in the South. They produce lots of fawns. And I haven't heard or seen data that shows too many antlerless deer are being harvested to negatively impact the population.
Excellent, thank you. Okay, we're gonna hit one more topic, and like I said, we have to have Richard back because I could keep feeding him these questions all day long. Um, Another hot button topic, probably the biggest hot button topic that we've seen ever: baiting. Should is baiting useful? Is it ethical? Should it be allowed nationwide, or should it be banned?
It is useful. It shouldn't be banned. The biggest negatives that people claim regarding baiting is it spreads disease, number one. And if you've walked with whitetails as much as I have and observed their social interaction, you would understand that whether you have baiting or not, deer have tremendous social interaction that's responsible for spread of disease without bait. So banning baiting for reasons of spreading disease is not a valid reason, in my opinion, based on 30 years of walking with whitetails, bucks and does of all ages. The does and fawns mutually groom one another multiple times a day. And bachelor groups of bucks, I've seen bachelor groups of bucks mutually grooming and licking their noses and nose-to-nose contact multiple times. That happens without baiting. The intimate contact between bucks and does during the breeding season is probably largely responsible for the spread of disease, where bucks lick urine from multiple does every fall. They lick the noses and mouths of deer. I've filmed them doing this breeding behavior. They lick the rear of does, the tarsal glands that they're courting. Those are primary ways the diseases are spread. Banning baiting doesn't accomplish that. And part of the reason the Michigan DNR may be not testing for CWD mandatorily is it would show that the ban on baiting that has been in effect in the Lower Peninsula for 5 years now, 4 years, has not reduced the spread of the disease. And once they do find out the prevalence rates of the disease, it'll confirm that. And I've seen it firsthand umpteen times. You can't prevent deer from interacting with one another, whether you have baiting or not. And the reduction of the use of bait in the Lower Peninsula has reduced the deer harvest. It has allowed the spread of disease much more than would have happened if hunters had harvested more deer. That's the only way to control the spread, is with increased harvest of deer.
So what is the difference between throwing out a pail of corn that you sprinkle, across an area, and planting an acre of turnips?
In my opinion, there's not a whole lot of difference, except you can plant the acre of turnips on private land, but you can't plant a food plot on public land. Bans on baiting restrict hunters who don't have their own private land to hunt on and make a food plot. It prevents them from luring deer to a spot where they can see animals and potentially shoot one. The other argument against baiting is it's unethical, unsporting, unfair. Now, I've hunted over bait for many years, and I don't think it's increased my success to the point that is threatening the deer population and reaches a level of being unethical or unsporting. The deer have excellent senses. Unfortunately, they sense my presence far too often and manage to escape. And it's true in any place that baiting is legal. I have a hard time understanding the situation in Maine. It's legal to hunt bears over bait in Maine. In fact, it's popular, but it's illegal to hunt deer over bait. And I've heard there's a television program on the Outdoor Network called Wardens. And repeatedly, I've heard wardens claim that hunting deer over bait is unfair and unethical, yet bear hunting is legal and okay. I think those comments are playing into the hands of anti-hunters. What data do they have to show that baiting deer is unfair and unethical? I've not heard them use any data to verify those comments. I don't think there is any.
I'm in your camp on this, Richard, because as you have, I've seen the world when it comes to whitetail hunting. I've hunted, 27 states. I've seen people bait in Texas. I've seen people not bait up in Alberta. I've hunted the different areas. The argument that comes from hunters is that, let's take the bear hunters, for example. Well, if you couldn't bait bears, there's no other way you could shoot them. Okay, there are other ways you could shoot them, but I'll give you that. To which I'm going to say, because I used my dad, rest his soul, he passed away last June, he hunted 3 acres. If he had not sprinkled out bait, there's no way. I said the odds of him seeing a deer were like taking his blind and putting it in the Kmart parking lot. It was about equal about the odds of seeing a deer. So what was wrong with that And in that situation, especially, and I know this is across the country, suburban Milwaukee, suburban Atlanta, suburban Detroit, where guys have 3 or 5 acres that they live on, and they have some woods, and they could put a tree stand back there. If they're doing the community a service by shooting. I mean, he would pile them up. He'd shoot 3 or 4 does a year.
Mm-hmm.
And people can scoff at that, but it's the honest truth. And then what do they do when cities have too many deer? What do they do when they bring in sharpshooters? They bait them. So on one hand, they're saying, well, that's spreading disease, but you know what? We have to do it so we can kill some deer out of here. Yeah. It doesn't make any sense.
And there's clear data. There's data that shows that hunters who use bait versus those who don't have a higher success ratio. And that's important when you consider disease and the spread of it. You want to increase the harvest. But for an excellent point you made about hunters who have small parcels of land to hunt, and if you can't bait, it reduces their chances of seeing deer, much less shooting one. An important thing in Michigan, years ago when baiting was unrestricted, it was a problem when there was no difference between supplemental feeding in the winter and baiting during the fall. People were using truckloads of bait, and I understand how TB got established in the Northeast Lower Peninsula with that type of baiting and feeding. So Michigan now has restrictions on the amount of bait hunters can use every day. 2 gallons of bait spread over 100 square foot area. And usually when I'm baiting, I use less than that. It increases competition for the limited food supply. But some type of regulation where hunters get carried away is important. So there's room in the middle between a ban and legalizing it, having restrictions, limiting the quantity of baits. It reduces the number of deer that visit that location, and that reduces the chances for spread of disease, even though I don't think it contributes to it at all.
I agree. Well, Richard, we're going to cut it off there. Like I said, we have to have you back. Where can people go to find your books, find some of your writing? I know you have a lot of stuff on your own website.
Yeah, richardpsmith.com.
richardpsmith.com. Check it out. We're going to put the link in the comments wherever you're listening to this podcast or watching this podcast. Richard, thank you so much for joining us today.
A pleasure talking to you, Dan.
Okay, we're going to do it again. For Richard Smith, I am Dan Schmidt. Thank you for joining us for the Deer Talk Now podcast. Be sure to download the podcast or just go and watch them all. We've surpassed 100 episodes of this new format. Check them out wherever you can watch them, listen to them, and also watch them at our YouTube page, which is YouTube.com/DDH Online, Instagram, Facebook, wherever you can find deer and deer hunting. We will catch you next Thursday for another episode of Deer Talk Now.